Could I have a moment of your time? It's about your mother.
The doctor holding my arm looked at me with a deeply concerned expression. It's been 10 years since my mother started using a wheelchair. She comes to the hospital regularly for checkups and physical therapy. We came for her treatment, and right now, she's in the middle of an exam. While I was waiting to take her to the therapy session, the doctor took me aside by the arm.
If it's about my mother, I'll hear it from her primary doctor.
I gently shook my right arm free from her grip. The doctor standing in front of me was a woman, but my mother's primary doctor was a man. I hadn't been told of any change in her care team. Why was a different doctor saying she had something to tell me about my mother? Looking at her with doubt in my eyes, the woman doctor appeared flustered, wrapping her hands around mine.
It's a matter I prefer to discuss without your mother or her primary doctor listening. That's why I wish to speak with you in private.
Just me?
Seeing the serious expression on her face, I took a step toward her. My name's Michelle, and I'm 35. I am a single office worker. I work for a major corporation, though currently, due to certain circumstances, I'm working remotely rather than going into the office. Since I can remember, I've grown up in a single-parent household with my mother, Karen. My parents divorced when I was very young, so I don't remember my father's face or what he was like at all. The only thing I know is that his name is Matt. According to my mother, he was a completely hopeless man. She said he treated her like a slave and, claiming that having a child was inconvenient, left us to be with a younger woman he was seeing. As far as I know, they've never been in contact, and I've heard that my mother disposed of all the photos of him. Given the circumstances, there was no custody battle after the divorce, and my mother took me in. She worked late into the night and raised me single-handedly with everything she had. I can never thank her enough. Because of her, I was able to go to college and even land a job at a major company. My mother gave me so much love that I never felt lonely growing up in a single-parent family. Besides, I have no desire to see my father now. Since I was young, my mother has told me many times.
He was just hopeless. So, Michelle, I want you to think of it as if you never had a father from the start.
When I first heard about how he treated her and the cheating, I couldn't control my anger toward him. So even when I saw other kids with both parents at school events, like open house days, I never felt jealous. As my mother advised, I lived my days without thinking much about my father. When I started my job, I also moved out and began living alone. Work was busy but fulfilling, but when I turned 25, everything changed. My mother had a car accident, leaving her needing a wheelchair. She could no longer work due to her immobility, and the mother who'd always stayed cheerful despite the hardships lost her smile after the accident and became withdrawn. With limited movement, she began to feel mentally burdened. Over time, several caregivers helped her, but none seemed to be the right match, and my mother grew increasingly frail. Eventually, she contacted me multiple times, asking,
I feel so lonely. Could you come back home?
Worried about her, I decided to move back to take care of her. I planned to use some of my paid time off and focus on caregiving for about a week. At first, I thought I would return to my place once she regained her strength. She seemed reassured by my return and even started smiling a few days later. Her attitude changed completely after telling her that I'd had to go back soon because of work. She didn't let me go home. She clung to me, half hysterical, sobbing.
No, Michelle, please don't go. Don't leave me alone.
Oh, okay, Mom, calm down. I understand. I'll check in with my company again.
I was perplexed, yet I couldn't find it in me to reject the mother who had single-handedly raised me, to whom I am deeply indebted. Besides, she'd been against me living alone when I first started working. We were living together again. The loneliness must have become too much for her to bear. Her legs were weak, and her mental health had declined. I spoke with my company, and until my mother's legs stabilized, I arranged to work remotely with shorter hours. Since then, she has refused to be alone for even a moment. Even when I work from home, she clings to me, constantly wanting to be by my side. I asked her to step out of the room since I can't let my colleagues see her like that on calls, but she waits right outside the door, always within sight. It feels as if I'm being watched all the time, and there were moments I grew frustrated with myself for feeling that way. My mother continued with physical therapy at her regular appointments, but her legs showed no signs of improvement. As a result, there's no hope of my returning to the head office anytime soon. My personal life is also centered around caregiving for her, so I haven't had the chance to meet anyone or find a boyfriend. It's my 10th year in this routine. My mother is now 60, and it seems that her dependence on me has worsened as she ages. If I mention leaving home just to go grocery shopping, she becomes frantic, saying,
Take me with you.
and causing a commotion. It takes a long time to calm her down, so returning to living on my own is completely out of the question. Yet I could never abandon my own mother, who has loved and raised me since childhood. One day, something unusual happened. My mother had a routine checkup scheduled that day, and as always, I went with her to the hospital. Her primary doctor, Tucker, a man in his 40s, has been caring for her for the past 10 years. I trust him immensely. After my mother entered the exam room for her tests, I stepped outside the hospital briefly to handle some work matters. About 10 minutes later, just as I was heading back to the exam room, a doctor stopped me.
Excuse me, sorry for interrupting. Are you Karen's daughter?
Karen is my mother's name. The person addressing me was a woman around my age who introduced herself as Amy. She had recently started working at this hospital and was in the same department as Dr. Tucker, my mother's primary doctor. Surprised, I replied,
Yes, that's right. Is there something wrong?
Do you have a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss regarding your mother.
My mother? Oh, yes, that's fine.
Assuming her checkup wasn't finished yet, I nodded in agreement. Dr. Amy seemed slightly relieved, her expression softening as she led me to a small private room near the exam area, likely a consultation room. She gestured for me to sit, so I settled into a chair, and she sat across from me, separated by a small desk, looking directly at me as she began.
You're currently back at home to care for Karen, right?
Yes, that's correct.
I told her about how I've been working from home and caring for my mother, Karen, for the past 10 years. Since moving back, I've rarely had time to go out with friends, and I'd never shared these things with anyone before. Dr. Amy quietly listened, nodding as I spoke, which led me to vent a bit about my situation.
Sorry. I didn't mean to go on like that.
It's all right. 10 years, huh?
She smiled gently but then looked down thoughtfully. After a moment, she lifted her gaze to meet mine with a serious expression and began to speak. Before she could say anything, a scream that sounded like my mother's pierced my ears. Startled, I ran to the door, and when I saw what was happening, I was left speechless. Dr. Amy slowly shook her head.
You need to leave your home immediately. It would be best if you escaped from your mother.
Her words left me silent. Holding back a wave of anger, I thanked her and then left the hospital without going back to see my mother. As soon as I got home, I began packing in a hurry. Even then, I couldn't shake the image of my mother from the hospital out of my mind. About 2 hours passed as I continued packing. During that time, my phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from my mother. I assumed she was panicking since I hadn't shown up after her appointment and therapy session. However, I ignored the constant calls, only answering in the evening once my packing was nearly done.
Michelle, where are you? I've called you so many times. Why didn't you answer?
The moment we connected, my mother yelled at me. Normally, I would have apologized immediately, but this time, I replied curtly.
I'm home.
You left me behind and went home first. How could you do that to me?
My mother's voice grew frantic and desperate. I sighed and then told her.
Mom, listen. I can't live with you anymore. I'm leaving.
What? What are you talking about? If you leave, I won't be able to manage on my own. How am I supposed to get home from the hospital?
Why don't you walk back? Your legs are completely fine. You don't actually need a wheelchair or a caregiver, do you?
At my words, she let out a small, panicked cry. I could imagine her looking utterly shaken.
I know everything you've been hiding, Mom.
I went on to tell her about what Dr. Amy had shared with me and what I'd witnessed myself at the hospital. According to her, recent tests had shown that my mother's muscles, bones, and nerves were all functioning normally. This led her to suspect that it might be a psychosomatic issue. She thought my mother had convinced herself she couldn't walk, which in turn made her physically unable to do so. Apparently, the power of belief is not to be underestimated, and Dr. Amy wanted to explore mental health support alongside physical therapy. That was why she had called me in, to suggest that I, as a family, could help with my mother's mental care as part of her therapy. At that moment, a woman's scream echoed from the exam room.
What? Was that my mom's voice?
Dr. Amy and I looked at each other and rushed to check on the situation in the exam room. There was a window in front of the exam room through which I could see inside, and I saw my mother making a gesture as if swatting away a bug. It was indeed my mother who had screamed. While I was puzzled about the presence of a bug in the exam room, it turned out that she had confused some dust for an insect. I watched as she pinched up the dust and took it to the trash can. She had taken the dust to the trash herself, walking without a wheelchair, without a cane, and with a light, quick step. Dr. Amy pushed me in shock out into the corner of the hallway, and as I peeked out, I saw that my mother was completely unaware of us watching her. She walked back to the wheelchair with a completely casual expression and calmly sat down. Dr. Tucker then passed by where we were standing, entered the exam room, and approached my mother, extending his hand. My mother placed a small brown envelope into his palm. He slipped it into his pocket as if nothing had happened, then calmly pushed her wheelchair and escorted her to the rehab facility.
Michelle, are you all right?
I stood there in stunned silence, unable to move until Dr. Amy whispered to me. It wasn't that my mother couldn't walk, nor was it that she thought she couldn't. She could walk, she'd simply been pretending she couldn't. Dr. Amy placed a steadying hand on my trembling shoulder, slowly shaking her head.
You need to leave home immediately. Run away from your mother.
I finished packing with her words echoing in my mind, all in preparation to escape from my mother. While I told her everything, my mother remained silent on the other end of the line. Eventually, I heard a deep sigh through the phone, and perhaps realizing she couldn't talk her way out, my mother began to speak the truth.
It's true I was in a car accident and that I suffered injuries serious enough to need care. But thanks to rehab, I was able to walk again with a cane about 2 years after the accident.
Hearing this, I was left in shock. She had recovered in just 2 years? Then what were the 10 years I dedicated to her for?
But if you knew I could walk, you'd leave my side, right? I didn't want that.
She said selfishly. I had always understood from her behavior that she adored me to an excessive degree. That was why she had me care for her, keeping me bound to her side so I couldn't go anywhere else.
I love you more than anyone else. I was lonely.
She said repeatedly, but her words did nothing to move me.
In these 10 years, many of my coworkers at the office have been promoted, and some have gotten married. I had sacrificed my career and any chance of marriage for you. I've wasted 10 years of my life. Why did you lie and make me take care of you? I kept in contact and visited on holidays. Why did it have to be this way?
Tears began to fall as I berated her, and I finally told her I had no intention of continuing her care. Then, I said,
I'm leaving today. Don't ever contact me again.
And rejected her. She was panicking and still shouting something, but I hung up without listening. 1 month later, I resumed living on my own. I was at a certain hospital. Just as I was about to leave after my appointment, someone familiar ran up to me. It was Dr. Tucker, who had been my mother's primary physician. His cheeks were sunken, and fatigue seemed to radiate from his entire body, looking quite different from the man I remembered. I wondered why he was at this hospital, but he approached me with a desperate expression, leaving me no choice but to listen to him. Dr. Tucker admitted that he had known my mother's legs were healed from the beginning and had been accepting money from her in exchange for diagnosing her as disabled. He confessed that the envelope he'd received from my mother that day contained cash. Apparently, Dr. Amy's report had led to the hospital discovering the scheme, and he had been fired immediately afterward. Furthermore, due to his continued forgery of medical documents, he now faced criminal charges for issuing false diagnoses, an impending arrest, and the likely revocation of his medical license. Yet he claimed he was innocent. To my surprise, Dr. Tucker insisted that the money wasn't a bribe from my mother but hush money from me. He alleged that I had devised a plan to declare my mother disabled to fraudulently obtain pension funds and that I had pressured him to issue the necessary documents by paying him hush money. Of course, there was no truth to any of this. At that time, it was Dr. Tucker who had extended his hand to my mother. It was beyond belief that, now facing arrest and disaster, he was trying to place the blame entirely on me.
What are you talking about? I would never do such a thing.
No, that's the truth. I'm going to tell the police everything.
He shouted, his eyes bloodshot, causing me to go pale. Dr. Tucker had no evidence to back up his claims. I knew proving that I had no involvement with them would be challenging. My mind went blank as I worried about facing a demand for the impossible, proving a negative, when suddenly a man approached me. The man stepped in front of me, shielding me from Dr. Tucker.
You're the hospital director here, aren't you? I need to speak with you, please.
The moment he saw the man's face, Dr. Tucker turned pale. He forced a smile and nervously rubbed his hands together as he tried to approach, but the man glared at him with a frown.
What exactly are you doing to my daughter?
Daughter?
The man, who had glared at Dr. Tucker, was indeed the director of this hospital and, surprisingly, my father, Matt. Yes, my father who had divorced my mother when I was young. As it turned out, he was a doctor. We had reconnected only recently, but after his divorce from my mother, he quickly rose through the ranks and eventually became the director of a major hospital. He was also one of those supporting Dr. Tucker's license revocation after discovering his misconduct.
Oh, so, your family. That explains it. Please allow me to explain. I was forced by her to write the diagnosis. I had no choice. As her father, it must be hard for you to see your daughter entangled in crime, right? Please, I'm begging you to put in a good word for me.
Dr. Tucker fell to his knees, pleading for mercy from my father. My father shook his head with a severe expression.
Don't be ridiculous. You two deceived everyone in this hospital, the authorities, and even the daughter who cared for her mother for 10 years. She did it to keep her daughter tied to her and to receive disability benefits, while you did it to pay off gambling debts. You're both frauds. Accept your punishment and make amends.
My father dismissed Dr. Tucker's pleas without hesitation.
No, damn it.
Realizing there was no escape, Dr. Tucker collapsed on the spot, defeated. As people around began murmuring, I could do nothing but watch, feeling an indescribable mix of emotions. Suddenly, I felt a strong pull on my arm from behind. Startled, I turned around to see none other than my mother standing firmly on both feet with a terrifying expression.
What are you doing to my Michelle?
She screamed, glaring at my father.
Mom, what are you doing here?
I knew Dr. Tucker was looking for you, so I followed him.
The sheer intensity of her obsession, thinking she'd see me if she followed him, made chills run down my spine.
Give Michelle back to me. I won't let you take her.
My mother shrieked at my father, her face twisted in a fury I had never seen before. I shook her hand off and shouted,
Stop it already. I know now that everything you told me about Dad was a lie.
At those words, my mother's expression changed to one of panic. It turned out she had fed me lies from the time of their divorce to make sure I would never want to meet him. All the stories about him treating her like a slave and leaving with a younger woman. None of it was true. My father, an accomplished doctor, had always been busy and rarely took time off. My mother had agreed to marry him, fully aware of his demanding career, but her attitude had changed after I was born. She had criticized him for his absences and the lack of family trips and decided on her own that he was not a good father to me, eventually filing for divorce. On my 3rd birthday, she suddenly took me and left the house. It wasn't my father who walked out, it was my mother who had left. In the divorce negotiations, even though my father had enough income, he didn't have the time to raise a child, so custody went to my mother. However, he had been sending generous child support every month for my benefit, something I'd only recently learned after talking with him. My mother had never told me any of this. Since we became a single-parent household, she gradually grew dependent on me and fed me false stories about my father, branding him as a deadbeat so that I wouldn't seek him out, knowing he was financially secure. My father had made repeated attempts to meet with me over the years, but my mother had always refused, telling him that I didn't want to see him. There had even been times when meetings were nearly set up, but emergencies had called my father away, or my mother had found some excuse to cancel at the last minute. Since childhood, I had been told my father's whereabouts were unknown and that there was no way to contact him, but even that was a lie. The reason my mother never moved back in with her own parents despite being a single mother, and the reason she could afford to send me to both high school and college, was thanks to the child support my father sent, allowing us to live comfortably. So, the story about her working late every night to raise me was also a lie. In reality, she worked part-time during the day to make it seem like she was dedicated to child rearing, while in the evenings, she would go out to enjoy herself, coming home late to reinforce her image of a struggling single mother. When my mother weakly muttered,
Proof.
my father replied,
The child support and school fees I paid, as well as records from the place you worked, will confirm your hours.
My mother slumped to the floor in defeat. Seeing her like this, I realized that I had lived my whole life surrounded by my mother's lies since childhood. Finding out the truth had been shocking, but now my anger far outweighed that shock.
Thank you for everything until now. But it's over.
I said coldly, and my mother clung to me.
Wait, Michelle. I did it all for you.
No, it was all for yourself, wasn't it? You received plenty of money, pretended to struggle as a single mother, lied to ruin 10 years of my life. Did you enjoy it? I can't trust you anymore. Don't ever contact me or my father again.
With my mother standing there in stunned silence, unable to make any more excuses, I declared our estrangement and left the hospital with my father. Afterward, Dr. Tucker was arrested and his medical license was revoked. Due to repeated forgery of medical documents, he received a prison sentence and was also hit with a large compensation claim from the hospital for damaging its reputation. As for my mother, she was ordered by the authorities to return all the pension money she had fraudulently received along with interest and was also charged with fraud. What kind of life she will lead from here on out is no longer my concern, as we have severed ties. As for me, I realized I had become somewhat dependent on my mother without knowing it, and the shock of betrayal took a toll on my mental health, so I began seeing a specialist at a large hospital. I reunited with my father when I was getting a referral letter written. Recognizing my full name, he'd approached me, and it made me happy to know he hadn't forgotten me. Having returned to my position at the main office, I'm working hard while continuing my treatment. Later, when I went to thank Dr. Amy for telling me the truth about my mother, we exchanged contact information. Since we're close in age, we've become friends, occasionally meeting up for tea. It's been a long time since I've had casual chats and life talks with someone other than my mother, and I genuinely enjoy it. I've also started reconnecting regularly with my father, regaining the time we missed as a family.
I'm going to see a movie with Amy soon. It's been about 10 years since I went to the movies with someone, so I'm really looking forward to it.
I told my father one evening when we went out for dinner after work. With a gentle smile, my father said,
From now on, live your life the way you want to, Michelle.
I nodded deeply, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Looking forward, I am dedicated to creating a future brimming with happiness and fulfillment, living life on my own terms.